Okay, welcome. I'll just wait a minute just to allow people to come into the webinar. Excellent. So we might make a start. So thank you for joining our webinar today about our latest edition of the Australia's Aged Care Sector Report. And I'll be joined today by my colleagues, Nelson Ma, Jinsoo Yang, and Yolanda Lin. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands on which UTS now stands and where we are broadcasting from, and extend that respect to the custodians on the lands upon which you might be joining us from today, as well as elders past and present, and any First Nations people here present in the meeting today. In terms of what we'll be covering today, we will go through the highlights of our report, starting with the sector-wide developments, then flowing through into home care and residential care as well. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them in the Zoom chat. We'll also make a copy of these slides available for download after the presentation on the UARC website. So we're excited to release what is the 7th edition of this report, which is produced in collaboration between UARC and Stuart Brown. It also draws on the expertise of members from across UARC, including in business and accounting, economics, health and design. And most importantly, it's informed by continuous engagement with sector stakeholders, many of whom are joining us here today on the call. Pleased to report that the report is now available for download on the UARC website. And when you open it up, you might notice that it's a slightly different structure from the previous 6 editions, in that it's organised more thematically around our sector-wide developments, home care and residential care, and with a revision of how we present some of those results with some explanations of those different indicators. So to kick off, I'll briefly start with some overarching developments affecting the whole of the sector. Perhaps the most prominent of these is the postponement of the start of the Aged Care Act to the 1st of November 2025. This postponement will allow the government, the various government agencies, to work with the sector to ensure an effective transition to the new Act, to support at home and the new regulatory regime. A specific issue is the finalisation of the financial and prudential standards, which the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission released in draft earlier this year. In our report, UARC summarises our submission to the Commission, which is also available for download on our website. I'm not going to go through entirety of the submission today, but 2 issues perhaps warrant further consideration. The first is a point of inconsistency between the standards and the Act, in the sense that while the standards are intended to strengthen the financial accountability, they omit explicit reference to the need for the aged care system to be managed in a way that to ensure sustainability and resilience, which is specified as objects of the new Aged Care Act. Second, there is perhaps a missed opportunity to ensure the standards align with a regulatory approach that is risk proportionate. That is, it's proportionate to the risk both across the sector in general, as well as accounting for the specific risk profiles of different types of providers. A third issue that we will come back to later in this presentation regards the proposed minimum liquidity amounts and the impact on capital investment. Now, to take us through the next section, I'll pass over to my colleague Yolanda to take us through the results for home care.
Thanks, Nicole. So in this sector report, we analysed the financial results of home care services for the first 6 months of the current financial year. That's from July to December 2024. So our analysis is based on data from 90 providers delivering around 76,000 home care packages, representing approximately 1/4 of all packages available nationwide. It's important to note that our sample in this analysis is weighted towards large providers and non-for-profit organizations. So first of all, in terms of the overall financial performance, after several years of declining financial performance, the average operating results for home care providers has stabilized at $2.05 per client per day during the first 6 months of the current financial year. However, it is important to note that this average operating performance remains at a very low level compared to the median. There is also a significant variation in operating results between the highest and the lowest performing providers. So these performance differences will be explored more in detail later in the presentation. And while the prior slide presented operating results in dollar terms, the performance become even more concerning when we view the performance as a percentage of the total revenue. So over the past 5 years, the median profit margin for providers has declined from 6.2% in December 2020 to 3.3% in the first half of this current financial year. So the smaller profit margin highlights the ongoing viability risks of home care providers. Especially providers with poor financial performance may lack the resources to deliver high quality care to older Australians and may ultimately choose to exit the market. Such exits could reduce market supply and limit access to services for those in need. Since 2019 and 2020, there has been a growing reliance on third-party services to deliver in-home services as well. So the stacked bar chart showed on these slides breaks down the home care expenses. What we can see here is the black segments represent spending on third-party services, while the blue segments reflect the spending on direct care delivered by home care providers' own employees. So when we look at the bar chart in December 2020, for every dollar providers spend on care delivered by their own employees, they spend approximately 39 cents on third-party services. However, by December 2024, this proportion had risen to 63 cents. So in this current financial year, for every dollar the providers spend on their own employees, they spend 63 cents on third-party services. So it is important to note that third-party arrangements typically generate lower margins than services delivered by in-house staff and often require additional administrative resources. Providers with a great reliance on brokered services are also more exposed to price increase risk imposed by third parties. In this sector report, we also reported the package utilization. So package utilization is a measure that measures the proportion of available subsidies spent in a given period and is a key indicator of provider revenue. After several years of declining utilization and the rising unspent funds, the latest results suggest that the providers are increasingly able to convert allocated funding into revenue to support their short-term financial sustainability and service continuity, while care recipients are also utilizing more services. In nominal terms, the average unused subsidized per client per day fell from $16.72 in December 2023 to $11.64 in December 2024. This increase in package utilization is likely to have been driven by providers lifting service prices after package subsidy rates were increased to fund the Fair Work Commission aged care work case. Now, I will hand over to Nicole for a reflection on the home care performance.
Thank you, Yolanda. So if we want, in the report, we present analysis and commentary in addition to those results. to allow us to do a deep dive into issues as they relate to this particular period. Now, in relation to home care, there are three key issues that we explore in this edition of the report. The first of those is the growing wait list for home care packages. So this graph shows that in the last 5 years, there's been a substantial expansion of the home care package program, which is now servicing almost 300,000 individuals. However, there's also been, in recent times, a progressive increase in the number of people on the wait list. So the latest results from December 2024 indicate that there are roughly 83,000 people on the national priority system. And this number is almost triple the number in mid-2023, that is down in June. So this growing wait list also is reflected in growing wait times. So for example, someone assessed at level 4 with as assessed as needing a level 4 package with a medium priority level is now estimated to wait approximately 12 to 15 months before they receive that level 4 package. To understand that growth in the national priority system, UARC has conducted further analysis on publicly available data from the department to understand the dynamics of the supply and demand for home care packages. More specifically, what we can see in this graph, the demand, which is proxied by the number of package approvals, has been gradually growing to about 40,000 approvals a quarter. In comparison, the number of packages released each quarter, the supply, dropped in mid-2023 and has not since caught up with the level of quarterly package approvals. As a result of the difference between the supply and demand, the wait list for home care packages has grown by approximately 9,000 individuals each quarter. It's worth reflecting that the consequences of the longer wait times are both significant and tangible. Perhaps front of mind is the fact that those individuals that are waiting for packages may experience deterioration in their health and well-being, including premature decline. In the meantime, they may also have to have early entry into residential care, encounter avoidable hospitalizations, or require greater use of the broader healthcare system. And it also places increased pressure on caregivers, and noting that the caregiving is disproportionately provided by women, this also has some gender effects. Now, the government has announced in September 2024 its aim to reduce wait times to 3 months by July 2027. And it has indicated that it seeks to achieve this through certain measures. For one, there'll be a new priority system that will replace the national priority system in the Support at Home program. The government is also considering introducing interim funding for those individuals who are waiting for Support at Home supports for longer than 3 months. And as with the new Act, there will also be increased transparencies about the time that individuals spend waiting for services. In addition to these measures, UARC would also caution, though, that expanding service access is only going to be effective in reducing wait times so long as there is a skilled and adequately distributed workforce to meet these increased service demand. And that's particularly the case in rural and remote areas. The second issue relating to home care that we raise in the report concerns the viability of providers, and in particular, understanding the dispersion of results that Yolanda mentioned before. We note in our analysis that the financial viability is becoming an increasing challenge within home care providers, with 40% of providers reporting a negative operating result from their home care package operations in the most recent period. Further, as we can see in this graph, which separates out the average operating result by home care providers by quartile, we can see that there is persistent disparities in performance across the sector, with the bottom 25%, those columns on the left, reporting substantial deficits, and the top 25%, those are the columns there on the right, having substantial surpluses. However, we note that this graph does have some limitations in the sense that when we conduct standard quartile analysis, those quartile groups are classified based on the performance each year. And that means that it creates a forced distribution. Put it another way, over those 5 years, a provider might have different classifications. For example, it might be in quartile 1 year, quartile 2 another year, and so that they can move between those groups. To overcome that limitation, we also conducted some retrospective analysis. And what we do here is we hold the groupings of the providers fixed based on their most recent financial performance. So looking backwards, what this graph shows is the operating result of providers as they've been grouped as of December 2024. And this graph here shows that the providers in the current bottom quartile, so those in the blue, if we look backwards, they have consistently recorded weaker results than other groups. And this indicates that their financial challenges are perhaps more structural than cyclical. We've also conducted some further analysis to understand what are the distinguishing characteristics of the providers that make up that bottom quartile. And our results indicate that on average, the providers in that group tend to be smaller in size with fewer packages and are more focused in their offering, in their package mix, on level 1 and 2 packages. In addition, the differences in the financial outcomes appear to be more driven by differences in spending rather than their revenue. With significantly higher expenditure per client per day by those providers in the bottom quartile, particularly on care management and administration. The third issue we explore about home care in the report has to do with some of the emerging challenges that we see as arising in the pricing arrangements for support at home. Now, as many of you know, from the 1st of November, service pricing will transition to a more transparent activity-based model, and this encompasses several features. One is that providers will set service prices, which will be inclusive administration and set on a per contact hour basis. Care management revenue will be capped at 10% of a client's quarterly budgets, and there will be no separate administration fees. Now, because of these changes, there will be increases in service unit prices. This is because in order to maintain viability, providers will need to increase prices to accommodate, first off, the inclusion of the administration costs. Second, the cost of non-contact time, if service prices are expressed on a per contact hour basis. Third, the cost of services that may have previously been funded somewhat through surpluses from, say, care management, which will now be capped. And finally, service prices may need to increase to provide a buffer for future increases in third-party provision costs. Now, while it is certainly critical that there are safeguards to ensure that the volume and the quality of services delivered continues, because of these reasons, higher service unit prices should not be interpreted in themselves as evidence of dysfunctional or exploitive pricing behaviour. And as such, these pricing changes are going to require clear communication from the government that can explain the mechanics of these price changes, particularly for individuals within the home care package program and those entering support at home. An additional challenge arising from the change in service pricing has less to do with the level of the prices, but in their underlying structure. In essence, the changes will reduce providers' fixed income streams. So currently, care management and package management fees are equivalent. These are income streams that are not necessarily tied strictly to service delivery, and they're equivalent to roughly 31% of revenue. In support at home, these will be capped at 10%. Now, while it's important that revenue relates the delivery of services to support at home, people using support at home, this change in the revenue structure will increase providers' exposure to demand fluctuations fluctuations in the volume and mix of their services. And you can see there's various reasons why demand is highly uncertain within home care, be it the changes in the client cohort, and changes to do with the scheduling of services driven by individuals' own choices and changes in their care needs. And the problem for this highly variable revenue stream in home care is somewhat similar to the problems we've spoken about previously around occupancy in residential care. And that has to do with the fact that although some costs can be adjusted in response to changing demand, many components cannot be easily scaled up or down in the short term. And that means to remain viable, providers either need to improve the accuracy of their demand forecasting, actively manage their service scheduling to smooth utilization as much as possible, and possibly incorporate a pricing premium to account for the financial risk of fluctuating demand. Now, this problem is not new. And in fact, UARC published research earlier this year based on evidence presented at the Royal Commission about this exact issue within the existing home care package program. The point here, though, is that the risk around demand uncertainty is likely to become more acute within support at home because of the change in the pricing structure. Finally, looking further ahead, UARC has continued to consider the case for introducing price caps, which are currently legislated to occur from July 2026. Now, price caps can have some benefits, such as safeguarding against overcharging and improving the clarity for participants, particularly about how much they may purchase with their quarterly budgets. However, price caps also introduce several risks, perhaps the primary one being the risk of price distortion, and that is the risk that the price doesn't actually match the cost of service delivery. And this risk could have several flow-on effects in terms of reduced service availability, or the deprioritization of higher cost participants, or service provider exits from thin markets. In addition, it may reduce provider flexibility and less focus on innovation and person-centered care. And also, to be effective, a price cap system will require substantial ongoing investment from the government to ensure appropriate data collection, analysis, and robust price modelling. Now, noting with the delay of the Aged Care Act, there is now a reduced time by which the government can observe provider pricing behaviour in support at home. So previously it was going to be 12 months, and now that's reduced down to 8 months. There is a case to be made that there should be further delay for the implementation of price caps until a point by which there can be robust evidence that demonstrates the existing market-based pricing arrangements, those backed by regulatory oversight, transparency, and consumer law protections, are no longer sufficient to deliver the intended outcomes of support at home. With that, we're going to change up gears and now move on to residential care, and I'll hand over to my colleague Jin to walk us through those results.
Thank you, Nicole. So the analysis of residential aged care homes are done by using a sample of 1,000 aged care homes and represents about 43% of all homes, and the sample is weighted towards more of a not-for-profit homes. So let's have a look at the mid-year financial outcome of residential aged care homes. So we have a good news. We can see an improvement in the financial performance of residential aged care homes. The operating result has improved compared to the last year, increasing from deficit of $4 to earlier to 10 cents per resident per day, which is basically very, very close to the break-even point. And compared to 2 years ago, with a deficit of $18 in 2022, this is much of a big improvement. So although this is somewhat a good news, as homes have recovered from the substantial losses reported a year earlier and losses in the last 4 years, the operating result margin remained volatile as there are many homes operating at a loss. The proportion of homes operating at a loss, which is shown in the black line in this graph here, has fallen slightly to 48%, which is down from almost 62% a couple of years ago. But nearly half of all homes remain in deficit, so still reflecting the ongoing financial pressures facing the sector. So we'll delve a bit more in detail of the various factors and breakdown of service area to better understand this. But for now, I just want to point out that the recent improvement in the operating result coincides with an increase in the government funding, particularly through the ANAC model and hoteling supplement. And some of this improvement could also be temporary, as some homes may have not yet fully met their mandatory care minute targets and have experienced financial challenges once the compliance is achieved. So one of the key factors that explains the improvements in the financial results of aged care home is the occupancy rate, which is the critical driver of financial viability. The average occupancy rate of home, as shown in this gray line here in this graph, have improved to 94% from 90% our lowest rate 2 years ago. It is interesting to note the regional differences in the occupancy rates here. You can see that the homes located in a major city, shown in the blue line in this graph here, consistently reported high occupancy rate above the data set average across all 5 years. In 2024, the average occupancy rate in the major city reported 94%, which is the highest of all the regional groups. Whereas on the other hand, the homes in medium rural towns and small rural towns and remote communities have consistently reported below average occupancy rate. So in this year, the MMM 5 and 7, which is the small rural and remote in green line here, reported 91%, and medium rural in orange line reported 92%. So there are several implications for achieving this high occupancy rate though. So for example, the improvement in the operating results, as we see in the previous slide, could be attributable to the high occupancy rate as homes can distribute fixed costs across the greater number of residents. However, the higher occupancy rate also lead to greater challenges, especially in meeting care minute targets, as homes have to increase their staffing costs to deliver more total care minutes to remain compliant and meet mandatory targets. And also, high occupancy rate could indicate the constrained availability of supply in local markets. And if the number of available places does not keep pace with demand, that prospective residents could face difficulty in assessing the appropriate care in their local areas. So to better understand the financial viability of residential aged care, we analyze their financial performance across key service areas. So this graph highlights the main areas. So the direct care services, everyday living, accommodation services. So it helps us to break down the contribution of each area to the improved operating results that we observed this year. So as discussed before, the operating results showing the orange line is near break-even this year. And this improvement in the financial outcome is the result of several key areas, especially the substantial surplus in the direct care services shown in the blue line, with a surplus of $19, which is partially offset by the continued deficit in two service area, which is the everyday living services in black line and the accommodation in red line. So it is worth highlighting the surpluses generated from this direct care, primarily funded by the taxpayers through the ANAC model, are used to cross-subsidize the losses in everyday living and accommodation services. So this increase in direct care services could be explained by the increase in the funding to cover the rising costs associated with the improved wages for aged care workers and to enable all homes to achieve the highest staffing levels, whereas the everyday living and accommodation services continue to show the deficits over the last 5 years. So there is a structural imbalance in sector's business model, and this may suggest the current funding and payment setting for non-care components are insufficient to cover the full cost of delivering these services. So it is sort of important to note that we address this structural funding shortfalls in everyday living and accommodation services, as it is especially concerning given the need to provide safe, appropriate housing for its residents at a reasonable accommodation prices, while also ensuring the delivery of sustainable services in the regional areas. So now, homes are required to meet the care minute targets. So let's have a look at the proportion of aged care homes meeting their mandated care minute targets here. So this figure shows that the compliance rate has improved over time. However, it has dropped in the most recent quarter, in the October and December quarter here, which could be due to an increasing target from October 2024. in September 24, just before the increase of target, just over half of all homes in the sector, about 50%, met or exceeded both their registered nurse and total direct care minute targets, which is shown in the red line here. And registered nurse targets compliance rate in blue line was higher at 71%, and the total direct care target compliance rate in black line was at 62%. So after the target has been introduced in October, the compliance rate for meeting both registered nurse target and total direct care target in the red line has declined to 43%. So this decline is attributable to a lower compliance rate with the total direct care target, but not quite from the registered nurses. So one of the key things that I would like to note here is that we have estimated this compliance rate by assuming that all homes have utilized the full 10% of the enrolled nurse times. And despite the care minute targets are gradually getting better, there are still a substantial proportion of homes remain non-compliant. And sustained improvement will depend on homes' ability to attract and retain sufficient staff, and particularly in areas that are facing workforce shortages. So what is the financial implication of meeting or not meeting care minute compliance? Here in this graph, we have average direct care expenditure in the blue bar and direct net results in black bar. So basically the total of these two values would add up to average total revenue. So we see here that homes meeting both targets on the bar on the far right shows the lower direct care margin of $14 per resident per day. So if you compare that to the other homes meeting different types of compliance rate. So homes meeting their total direct care reported about $16, and meeting registered nurse target only was $30. But when the homes does not or below both of those target actually had a highest direct care net result, which is $35 per resident per day. So although the homes meeting both targets had the highest direct care revenue on average based on the height of the bar, the key driver of the differences in the margin is the direct care expenditure, as you can see in this blue bar here. The homes meeting both targets spend more than those homes below both targets, as you can see in these blue bars from the far right to the far left there. This suggests that some homes may have not spent their funding amount in increasing the workforce investment and expenditure. And there are some changes in funding in the future that we expect from April 2026. Homes that meet or exceed their target will retain the full amount, while those falling short will receive a reduced supplement scaled to the degree of compliance based on the performance in the October and December 2025 quarter. So this proposed funding may change and also influence the behavior of those homes already close to meeting their targets. So our preliminary modeling suggests that the impact is likely to be more limited for those requiring a substantial staffing uplifts. In these cases, additional labor costs need to meet mandated targets are expected to outweigh the financial penalty of losing the supplement. So this challenge is further heightened for homes with more complex resident case mix here. So we have looked at the compliance rate of homes. Now let's have a look at the differences in the financial outcomes by quartiles. We continue to see the widening gap between the top and bottom quartile. So over the last 5 years, there have been an increase in performance in divergence, followed by the modest convergence in the most couple of years here. Looking at the top quartile in the orange line here, it has increased gradually to $49, whereas the bottom quartile homes have consistently reported losses over the last 5 years, which is at $51 in 2024. So there are several factors driving these results. The differences are mainly driven by variations in expenditure, particularly the staffing cost, rather than the revenue. The difference in revenue between the top and bottom quartile is relatively modest, around $10 per resident per day, whereas the difference in this expenditure is considerably larger at around $90 per resident per day. Also, other significant contributor to this divergence is the differences in the delivery of direct care minutes. So as of September 2024, homes in the top financial quartile were more compliant in meeting both direct care minute targets compared to the homes remaining to 75% of homes. And also, on average, top quartile homes are spending less than the bottom quartile homes. So furthermore, the homes with better financial performance have characteristics with higher average occupancy rate and more percentage of supported residents, and whereas the homes in the bottom quartiles are more likely to be located outside of metropolitan areas, smaller in scale, and operating either as standalone services or smaller providers. So speaking of the location, let's have a look at the financial outcomes of homes in different regions. The graph on the left shows that the average financial performance of homes across all regions have improved since 2022. So this is a good news to see that operating results have recovered over time, and the gap across those homes in the different regions has actually converged. The homes in medium and rural homes have increased the most, and this reflects the benefit of the more granular base carrier tariff structure introduced in October 24. But there is still a substantial variation across the region. So we can see only homes that located in the major cities reported a positive operating results of $4 in 2024, while all other regions reported an operating deficit. Let's try to understand better about this operating results by looking at the differences in the financial outcomes across key service areas. So we got the direct care, everyday living, and accommodation services. The graph on the right shows the homes in the major cities achieved stronger financial result than the non-metropolitan cities in the service areas. So not all categories, but in direct care, small, rural, and remote homes recorded the highest direct care results. And this is likely to reflect the relatively high funding and supplements available in this area. However, in the everyday living and accommodation categories, the financial results worsen as the remoteness increases. So it is worth highlighting that the degree of cross-subsidization between the direct care and non-care services varies considerably by locations, where regional and remote areas are relying more on cross-subsidization. All right, so how about the home size? Looking at the size of the homes, the figure on the left shows the smaller homes, those with fewer than 40 places, which are shown in the blue line here, are under significant financial pressure. So while other home sizes reported somewhat similar financial performance, smaller homes reported the lowest operating results of deficit of $14 in 2024. And continued to report losses over the last 5 years. And other home size group recorded a positive average operating results in the most recent period. So how about the result from the different service areas by home size groups here? The graph on the right shows that the differences in the financial performance of these homes and by the home size groups is mainly driven by the everyday living and accommodation services. So the direct care results on the left-hand side here of that right graph on the right, is somewhat similar across the home sizes. However, for the everyday living services and the results vary significantly across the home sizes, which is the main driver of the difference in this operating results. Smaller homes recorded a higher loss than larger homes, and this reflects the greater challenges the smaller homes to spread the fixed costs of activities over the limited number of residents. So smaller homes face financial challenges due to structural cost disadvantage. So where 60% of homes with fewer than 40 places, the smaller homes, are operating at a loss compared to only 42% of the largest homes. So there's a growing risk that small homes will become increasingly unsustainable and compromising equitable access to care in rural communities. So now I'll pass it on to Nelson to present the reflections on residential aged care.
Okay. Thank you, Jin. So in terms of residential care reflections, we looked at 3 main areas for commentary analysis in our sector report. So our first is accommodation. So as Jin spoke about, there seems to be a cross-subsidization effect in residential care, where surpluses from direct care are being used to fund deficits in everyday living and accommodation. So if we do a bit more of a deep dive into accommodation services, they remain the largest source of financial loss in residential care. And as of December 24, there are average deficits of about $10.94 per resident per day. That equates to about 25% of accommodation revenue. So looking at the graph on the right, we can see the red line is the accommodation result, which is the difference between the accommodation revenue in blue and the accommodation expenditure in black. And we can see that although accommodation revenue is growing year on year, we see the similar rates of growth in accommodation expenditure as well. And so this results in that flat accommodation result over the past 5 years. And so the government is committed to fixing this and addressing these issues regarding these deficits by first looking at higher regulatory price thresholds. So we know that from the 1st of January, the cap on RADs has increased from 550,000 to 750,000. So that increases what homes take in RADs. There's also a new RAD retention fee where providers would keep 2% of the RADs paid by residents every year for a cap of 5 years. So 10% of the total RAD is retained, and that's to keep up with the change in daily daily payments. Index daily payments, or DAPs, so those that pay daily payments instead of RADs, these will now be indexed biannually to keep up with inflation. And the government has committed to an independent accommodation pricing review in the next financial year. So understanding a bit further where these concerns around accommodation exist, if we look at the growth in accommodation prices, they've been relatively modest. So the median RAD for incoming residents has risen only about 12.6% over the past 5 years. So looking at the graph on the right, the blue lines show, or blue bars show, the change in median RADs. So from 410,000 in December 20 to about 461,000 in December 24. We contrast that against the growth in median house prices. So we all know that house prices in Australia, and especially the major cities, has grown substantially. In this case, over the past 5 years, the average growth in the house price has been about 40%. So we see this unbalanced growth in RADs as opposed to house prices, which are fundamentally based on the same investment in land. So as a general principle, prices should be set at a level which covers the operational and capital costs, while also allowing for a reasonable return. And so there's also consideration around whether prospective residents are willing and are able to pay for higher RADs. But considering that most older Australians, or many older Australians at least, do own a home, this growth in house prices should be able to fund these additional RADs. The last issue we looked at with regards to accommodation relates to location. So a lot of the aged care task force reforms may actually have uneven effects across geographical area. So if we consider homes in major cities, RAD values are generally higher. So they'll benefit. So providers operating homes in major cities will benefit more from having higher RAD intakes amounts, as well as they'll taking in higher RAD retention fees. We contrast that against homes outside of major cities. And outside these major cities, we have older Australians or people that hold assets that are more difficult to convert into liquid funds, that make it harder for them to actually get the lump sum deposits needed for a RAD. And in metropolitan areas generally, most homes, average RAD prices, already consume a substantial share of residents' home asset values. And so this might actually constrain future price increases. What we mean by that is if you look at the graph on the right, what we can see is the RAD price as a percentage of the median local house price across each of the areas. We can see that for major cities in the blue, the RAD price is about 45% of the local house price. That increases to upwards of 70 to 80% once you go into these more regional and rural areas. So these RADs actually take up a lot more, is a higher percentage of the median house price, which does create challenges for older Australians outside of major cities to afford a RAD to go into residential care. So moving on to the second issue, and this is regarding liquidity reforms. So the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission has actually proposed a new liquidity standard with an enforceable minimum liquidity amount. That is, providers need to have sufficient liquid assets on hand to cover 35% of quarterly cash expenses, 10% of RAD balances, and 10% of refundable retirement and independent living payment amounts. And so the idea behind this is that providers, the providers need to have sufficient cash to be able to pay off their expenses, as well as refund RAD and retirement living refundable amounts as needed. While in principle, this is a good idea, there are potential problems with implementing this particular requirement. The first is that these minimum liquidity amounts are there to mitigate financial distress and potential collapse. But financial stress scenarios like this are very rare. There are very few providers that have actually gone in collapsed due to lack of liquidity. We contrast that against the disproportionate effect that a minimum liquidity amount will have on the cost of capital, right? In other words, the borrowing cost of homes and providers. As providers that are underneath or beneath the minimum liquidity amount will have to borrow in order to meet that liquidity amount. And increasing their borrowings increases risk, and that increases their cost of capital and borrowing costs. So that's the first potential problem. The second is it overlooks low risk trading with the government. So this type of minimum liquidity amount is usually to protect suppliers from the possibility that their inflows are not reliable. But most inflows or revenue that providers collect is from the government, and the government is a reliable payer of these revenues. So there's a lot less risk that a provider will not receive the revenue that they need to fund their expenses and pay out RAD balances. And the last is the fact that there are regulatory exemptions that are provided where robust management of costs of their liquidity processes may actually substitute for a fixed liquidity amount. So these types of exemptions actually undermine the credibility of the framework being applied. If we look further into the impacts, UR did some analysis and modeling, which shows about 12.6% of providers, based on historical data, would fall below the minimum liquidity ratio. While it's not a lot, it's disproportionate, where non-compliance is about 3.6% for standalone homes, whereas it's about 36% for large chain providers. So this is a bit of a challenge from a more long-term perspective, because larger providers have been responsible for the largest share of new residential homes and places. So if you look at the graph on the right, what you can see is the counts of newly opened homes based on different size providers. So you can see the lines in the blue reflect standalone homes. They've opened about 49 homes since 2017, compared to small and medium chains, which have both opened about 72 homes since 2017. Whereas large chains have opened 103 homes since 2017. So this will create a longer-term challenge of actually encouraging providers to make long-term investments in residential care. And we know this is going to be a challenge because this is a challenge because as Jin spoke about, occupancy is reaching basically capacity at 94% on average. And that means that demand is increasing at a higher rate than supply is increasing. And without this capital investment by larger chains, we may end up with situations where a demand will outstrip supply, and Australians and older Australians will not be able to get the care that they need. So these liquidity ratios may have an effect on capital investment that is needed in the long term for the sector. The final issue we looked at is star ratings and whether or not they're informative for users, right? That is older Australians looking to go into residential care. So what we considered is whether or not star ratings or the level of star ratings that a home gets results in different levels of occupancy in that home. The logic being that a higher star rating would encourage more individuals to go into that particular home that has the highest star rating. And what we found is that homes that increased their overall star rating actually had a larger rise in occupancy compared to those with an unchanged or decreased overall star rating. So looking at the graph on the right, the first set of columns, we compare homes that are decreasing in blue and unchanged in black against an increase in the overall rating. And what we can see is if a home had an increased overall rating, their occupancy increased by 1.3% compared to 0.6 and 0.7% for homes with unchanged and decrease in overall rating, respectively. This pattern holds for both metropolitan and non-metropolitan homes. And so a lot of this occupancy effect, or this higher occupancy, is for homes that actually increase their staffing and clinical quality measure rating subcategories. So moving on to looking at the consequences of these occupancy increases, what we considered is whether or not this joint effect of a higher overall rating and a higher occupancy leads to better operating results. And what we found is that for homes that had a higher overall rating and had higher occupancy, their operating results were actually higher. So referring again to the graph on the right, what we can see is that homes that had an increase in the overall rating and had higher occupancy, they had a $14 increase in operating results. Compare that to $11.95 for unchanged and $9.07 for a decrease in ratings. So it seems like there's a benefit from homes increasing their star ratings with higher occupancy. And on the flip side, if there's a stable or declined occupancy on the right section of that right graph, what we can see is that homes with an increase in their rating actually had a lower reduction, a lower deficit of $3.10, as opposed to about $7.89 for an unchanged and a $7.20 for a decrease. So it seems like there is an incremental benefit of having a higher overall rating, increase in their rating, on the operating results of these homes, although the main effect we know is occupancy itself. But there seems to be some informational value that older Australians looking to move into residential care may be gaining from the star ratings. And thank you, and I'll pass back to Nicole for Q&A.
Thank you, Nelson. Okay, so there is opportunity now to pose questions if you have any with the last few minutes that we have. I do note that in the Q&A, there's probably a comment there that perhaps those results around star ratings and occupancy are a little bit surprising to find that result, and we appreciate that. In one sense, these associations, there haven't been evidence of finding those, say, in the US. We also recognise that our modelling still early days, and so we're not able yet to establish causality, but obviously being able to see that difference in terms of a correlation is something that I'm sure Nelson will be looking further into in due course.
Yeah, just adding a bit on that. If I can provide a bit more detail regarding this correlation between star ratings and occupancy, at least the financial results, it seems like it requires a certain investment to get your star ratings up. And it seems like these homes that are willing to make that investment actually end up with higher occupancy and better financial results. So some of it could be base effects. In other words, what it was prior to the increase in the rating. So it seems like some of these homes actually had a bit more of a deficit while they were getting their rating up. And that increase in operating result occupancy may be a result of that, a result of more fundamental changes where management decide that they want to improve the quality of the home. So there's a lot more in there that we do need to tease out.
Yep, absolutely. And I can see that there'll be, there's another question there about asking, is it cost increases or is it differences in revenue? So I think there's probably interest in us teasing apart the different components and future iterations of the analysis.
Next report.
Next report. Wonderful. So just while we're kind of finishing up, I'll probably take this opportunity just for a few thank yous. First off, thank you to thank you to all the different organizations and stakeholders that have engaged with us in between reports. As I mentioned at the top, this report really does reflect the insights that we're privileged to receive from different stakeholders across the sector, which not only shape the priorities and the issues that we investigate, but also help in terms of our interpretation of those results as well. If you'd like to engage with us, feel free to reach out, either that email and the web address is there on the screen for you, and we can have a discussion offline. I'd like to also thank our partners at Stuart Brown and the work that Grant and David Sinclair's team and Kieran as well do to work with clients to develop a really high quality data set that enables us to do this analysis. As part of that, I would like to also have express the authors team thanks for all the providers that continue to participate in the Stuart Brown data collection exercises. We do draw on other data to inform the report, but it is important to recognise that collection forms the backbone of our analysis. So thank you for your continued support of that data collection. We hope that we do it justice in the way in which we be able to provide additional insights back to the sector. And finally, I would just like to say thank you to everyone that's joined us today for your time this afternoon to listen to us walk through these insights. We really appreciate your engagement and look forward to engaging with you further, either offline or in future presentations. Okay, with that, I'll close the session and wish you all a lovely afternoon. Good afternoon.